What up, aquarium peeps? It's Travis from Cywar Aquariums. For this video, I unbox, install, and give you some first impressions of my new CO2 injection system from Co2 Art. With my recent foray into planted freshwater tanks, I've been doing a lot of research. And from what I can gather, there's three major components to having a thriving planted tank: light, CO2, and fertilizer. I've got the light covered with two Radion G4 Pros. I've got the fertilizer covered with Nylock G's Thrive. So the last thing missing was CO2. After looking at a bunch of reviews and doing a fair amount of research, I decided to go with components from a company called Co2 Art. They're not the cheapest, but they're also not the most expensive. And the reviews I saw looked pretty promising. First, we have the regulator with a solenoid valve. This thing feels pretty well built. The knob turns and adjusts easily with just enough resistance to make fine adjustments. Next is 20 feet of premium CO2 resistant tubing. This is made of polyurethane, not silicone or plastic like some of the other airline tubing. CO2 resistant tubing is important because other forms of tubing can harden over time and cause leaks due to CO2 exposure. After that, we have the inline check valve. This is to prevent siphoning back into the regulator when it's shut off. Then the Bazooka in-tank diffuser. This style of diffuser is supposed to have more surface area and increase saturation. Next is a glass U-tube to attach the tubing to so it doesn't kink when going over the edge of the aquarium. And last is the CO2 tank itself. I purchased a brand new tank, then exchanged it at a local welding shop. Now that I had everything I needed, it was time to start the install. First, I inserted the provided plastic washer and attached the regulator to the CO2 tank. I hand tightened it, then used a wrench to finish it off, making sure to get it tight, but not so tight that I damage the threads. In a day or two, I'll come back and make sure it's still snug. Next, I added water to the bubble counter. This gives you a visual indicator of the flow rate out of the regulator. Then, it was time to attach the tubing to the top of the bubble counter. I placed the threaded fitting over the tubing, then pushed the tubing over the barb and tightened it down. I placed the entire unit into the cabinet and ran the tubing through the cabinet and up the back of the tank. I gave the tubing a little slack, cut it, and installed the check valve. Then, I added the glass U-tube. Now, it was time for the diffuser. After attaching the tube to the end of the diffuser, I placed it in the bottom of the rear compartment of the tank. I did this in order to prevent unsightly microbubbles in the main display. After that, I plugged the power cord into the solenoid. This next part I know is serious overkill, but it's still left over from my saltwater aquarium days, so I figured, why not? I plugged the solenoid into my apex and then programmed the timer. After doing some research, I determined that plants only utilize CO2 during daylight, so I looked at my programming for my lights and set my CO2 to turn on an hour before my lights ramp up and turn off an hour before my lights ramp down. And now for the moment of truth. It was time to crank up the CO2. I adjusted the needle valve and set the bubble counter to about 1 bubble per second. I wanted to start off slow because this is all new to me and I've heard horror stories about people killing all their fish with too much CO2. In order to monitor the CO2 levels in the tank, I bought a drop checker. The liquid will turn from blue to green when you have enough CO2 in the water, and it'll turn yellow if there's too much. After about 2 hours, I came back and looked at the drop checker. It had turned green and I was at optimal CO2 levels. All in all, this was a pretty easy setup. All the equipment I purchased was really good quality stuff, and time will tell how well it lasts. But I think this will be my setup for a long time. In about a month or two, I'll do a follow-up video and let you know if I'm seeing increased growth. But until then, if you like what you saw, make sure you hit that thumbs up, and if you want to see more of my planted tank, make sure you subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay fresh, aquarium peeps.